everyone, welcome back to CFI Helper. Today we're going to be covering how to calculate cloud base and freezing level, a pretty common written exam question and something that can be a little hard to grasp at first, but I promise you after this video it should make sense. So let's get started. In our example today, our surface temperature is going to be 12 degrees, as you can see here, and our dew point is going to be 5 degrees. Okay, I wrote a couple lapse rates that we're going to need to know up here. So our dry adiabatic lapse rate, as we know, is 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. And the other one you commonly hear is your saturated adiabatic lapse rate, which is 1.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. One that we don't hear about often is the dew point adiabatic lapse rate, which is 0.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. And so what do these lapse rates mean? For example, the dry adiabatic lapse rate is 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. So what this means is that this air parcel is cooling adiabatically. And that means that it's not exchanging its heat with its surroundings, with the air around it, but the temperature of this parcel is decreasing with altitude due to a decrease in pressure. So this might be a little easier to draw out really quickly just to understand. But for example, let's say this is your ground, and let's say you have a small parcel of air here, right? We know that the closer you are to the ground, the more pressure there is acting around that parcel. Now, as this parcel rises, it's going to become bigger, it's going to expand. And this is because there's now less pressure acting on it as we go upwards, okay? And with that comes a decrease in temperature. So that's basically all that is saying. We'll move on to how to find the cloud base and the freezing level, and then a lot of this will start to tie into what we're going to be doing today. So one of your first steps for finding the cloud base is finding the dew point spread. Okay, and so the dew point spread is going to be the surface temperature minus the dew point temperature. So in our example here, we have 12 degrees minus 5 degrees, meaning that our dew point spread is going to be 7 degrees, okay? And so in this diagram here, we know our surface here is 12, dew point is 5. So that's 7 degrees is going to be this difference right here. So now that we have that, our next step to finding the cloud base is we're going to be dividing that 7 degrees by a lapse rate. So this is where it gets a little important, because TC exams, you're going to be using a number that's just a little bit different. I'll show you what we are going to do in our example today and what you might be doing in your ABIA classes, but TC exams use a number that's a little more simplified. So to find our cloud base, we know that this air over here is going to be using the dry lapse rate, correct? However, there's a lapse rate we're not taking into account here if we only used the 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. And that's the temperature at which the dew point cools adiabatically, which is 0.5 degrees. So realistically, if you wanted to calculate the cloud base, it would be better to use the difference between these two lapse rates right here, between the dry adiabatic lapse rate and the dew point adiabatic lapse rate. So you would get 2.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. Okay, so if we were trying to make this a little more accurate, we would be dividing it by 2.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. We divide 7 degrees, right, by 2.5 divided by 1,000, because that is the lapse rate, correct? Now, what's different about TC exams is they only use the dry adiabatic lapse rate, the 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. So they're simplifying it. They don't want you to use the 2.5. They don't want you to take into account the dew point lapse rate. So we're only going to use the DLR. And I'll write that down here just because that's pretty important. But for TC, you're going to use 3 degrees per 1,000 feet, okay? Not the 2.5. And I'll compare the numbers after this so you can kind of see the difference between the two and how different they really are. So anyways, for finding the cloud base, we found our dew point spread, which is 7 degrees, and now we're dividing it by 2.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. And once we do that, we're going to get 2,800 feet. The 2,800 feet is going to be above ground level, so AGL. Now, what can you do to make this into ASL? Well, you're usually given the elevation, and we know that in our question, the elevation is going to be 1,000 feet. So if you were trying to find this in ASL, you would just add the 1,000 feet, right? So we know that our cloud base is 2,800 feet AGL, or 3,800 feet ASL. Perfect. So that's literally all you have to do to find the cloud base. We found the dew point spread, 7 degrees, and then we divide it by the rate at which the air here is cooling adiabatically, which in our case, taking in the dry adiabatic lapse rate and the dew point adiabatic lapse rate becomes 2.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. And now we found our cloud base. Now, to find the freezing level, the first step you're going to do here is you're just finding the temperature at the cloud base, which in other words is going to be our dew point temperature minus the freezing temperature, okay? But we know that the freezing temperature for water is always 0 degrees. So really, this step is probably the easiest one. You're just always going to take your dew point temperature, okay? Which is 5 degrees in our case. We know that the dew point temperature is the temperature at which the air becomes saturated and can begin to form this sort of condensation here. So our temperature at the cloud base is 5 degrees, literally written right here, okay? Now, this time, what lapse rate do you think we're going to be using? Because our freezing level might not be directly at the base of the cloud. Our freezing level could be a little bit higher up in the cloud. But what is different about the air in the cloud versus the air on the ground? Well, the air in the cloud here is going to be saturated air. So the lapse rate that we need to use in this example is the saturated adiabatic lapse rate. So what we do to find the freezing level is we're going to divide the 5 degrees by the saturated lapse rate. So we'll take our 5 degrees and we'll divide that by 1.5 degrees per 1,000 feet. And now, after you've done this, you'll find that we get the number 3,333 feet. The 3,333 feet is above the dew point. Okay, so that's important to note here. And I'll put that in blue. However, the numbers you're going to get on your TC exam are not going to ask you above the dew point. They're going to be asking you AGL or ASL, right? So how do we figure out our freezing level above ground level? Well, we know that this 3,333 feet is going to be above the dew point, right? So it's going to be somewhere up here. We can add this number to our cloud base. I'll write this over here for finding the freezing level. Let's say we want to find our example in AGL. We would add 3,333 feet above the dew point to this 2,800 AGL here. And in this example, our freezing level is going to be 6,133 feet above ground level. Whereas if you wanted to find it in ASL, we would add the 3,333 feet to our cloud-based ASL, right? If we calculated that, we would get 7,133 feet ASL. Okay, so that's literally it for finding the cloud base and for finding the freezing level. Now, if you wanted to compare the numbers between what we did here versus what you would maybe get on a TC exam, if this were your example, if we had divided our dew point spread by the dry adiabatic lapse rate, 3 degrees per 1,000 feet, which is what you would use on a TC exam, you would get 2,333 feet AGL, 3,333 feet ASL. And this is pretty important if you were trying to get the correct answer on like a PPL or CPL written, because that's a 500-foot difference there. So that's why it's really important to remember that when you're doing these questions on your TC exams, you need to be using 3 degrees per 1,000 feet. If you were doing the freezing level, instead of adding the number we calculated here, the number above dew point, to the 2,800 feet AGL, you would instead add it to these numbers that you calculated here, the cloud base you calculated with the dry adiabatic lapse rate. If you were trying to figure out the freezing level in this question, and we had used 2,333 feet AGL for the cloud base, using the 3 degrees per 1,000 feet, you would add 3,333 to 2,333, and with that, you would get 5,666 feet AGL for your freezing level. So again, that's quite different. That's about a 500-foot difference there, which is why you need to keep in mind this rule right here. So I hope that helped, and I hope that clarified anything that maybe you were confused about prior to the video. If you have any questions, please let me know. And if there's anything unrelated to this that you'd like me to make a video on, please just let me know in the comments below, and I'll be sure to take a look at it and try and make a video about that topic. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you guys in the next video.